You think that flashy uniform makes me bow down? A little black man like you? A general? Don't make me laugh." The cop snarled, teeth clenched, hand trembling as he pointed his gun inches from General Michael Carter's face. Right in Arlington National Cemetery, a sacred funeral, a war hero, and a gun in his face, just because he didn't look like someone who belonged there. Hundreds stood frozen, old veterans, young soldiers, decorated officers, stunned into silence. A man who bled for this country, now treated like an intruder on his own soil. What state are you in? Does your state have veterans? Do they get honored or humiliated at gunpoint like this? Michael Carter didn't like crowded funerals, not because he feared death, but because he had seen it too many times, too closely, too vividly. On patrol nights in the Kunar Mountains, death fell lightly like dust. One misstep was enough for a soldier never to return. Carter didn't keep count. He remembered faces, eyes that never got the chance to close, promises left unfinished. And finally, as the car silently rolled into the outskirts of the city, old memories returned like a chill seeping through his coat. Arlington wasn't the first time he had said goodbye, but this time was different. Alan Reeves wasn't just another old comrade. Reeves was the last one who ever kept the promise. "If I make it to 70, I'll call you old man instead of commander." Now, that promise, once again, had only one keeper left. In the passenger seat, Lily was silent. She wasn't the type to pry, and Carter was even less inclined to talk about the past. But the heaviness in the car grew so thick it compelled her to speak. "Are you sure you should go back?" she asked softly. "There's no one left there who calls you General?" Carter didn't respond right away. His eyes remained on the straight road ahead. "No need for anyone to call me that," he answered after a pause, "as long as one person remembers that I existed the right way." His voice wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was the voice of someone long accustomed to living without needing others to define who he was. The gates of Arlington National Cemetery came into view. The heavy black iron gates slowly swung open. No sound, no ceremony, just like the way the military buries its dead. Quiet, precise, emotionless. Rows of white headstones emerged in perfect order, lined up like soldiers at their final roll call. There were no generals or privates here. Everyone lay equal beneath the ground. But Carter knew well, this fairness only existed in death. Above ground, with different skin, with a different rhythm to your steps. Not everyone was seen the same. And Carter, though retired from service, removed from the battlefield, stripped of title, still carried one thing no one could take from him: the memory of truth. And he knew clearly, when the living are still judged unevenly, the dead won't rest easily either. He stepped out of the car but didn't move right away. Quietly, he adjusted his collar and the white gloves, now faded at the wrists. The uniform still fit him oddly well, even after 8 years of retirement. His officer's cap, with its silver eagle insignia, glinted faintly under the morning sun. His steps toward the memorial were steady, not proud, but measured. A man who had seen more than most, with no need for spectacles. Near the side gate, a group of police officers were chatting about last night's game. One of them glanced at Carter with a stare that lingered just long enough to cross the line into disrespect. His gaze slid from Carter's medals to his skin, speaking silently but clearly. The collar of his shirt stretched tight, as if the very uniform struggled to contain his arrogance. A faint smile passed his lips, uncertain whether it was a greeting or a sneer. Carter didn't stop. He walked on, eyes fixed on the platform ahead, where his old friend lay. Lily moved closer, gently resting her hand on his arm. "You don't want to go through the honor path?" she asked, pointing to the main gate with salutes and white flowers. Carter shook his head. "No," he said. "We'll go in from the back, like the ones who once left quietly." There was no bitterness in his voice, just the truth. And so he kept walking, step by step, back straight without looking back. And a man once in command of international operations, now walking through a crowd that didn't see him. No one saluted, no one recognized him. And that anonymity, in a place meant to honor every soldier, was the first spark that would ignite the fire burning through the ceremony's polished surface. The atmosphere at Arlington during funerals carries an almost absolute formality. No one is late, no one is improperly dressed. Every movement seems measured by a ruler and held in place by the invisible strings of military discipline. Yet, it is within that seemingly perfect order that the outliers are easiest to spot. No words are needed, just a slightly off step, a gaze held too long, or, like today, someone who does not bow their head as the national flag passes by is enough to set off the invisible radars in others' minds. Michael Carter chose a seat on the left side, under the shade of an old oak tree, not too conspicuous but not hidden either. From there he had a clear view of the podium where Lieutenant Colonel Allen Reeves' flag-draped coffin rested solemnly between two rows of soldiers standing at attention. Lily stood just behind him, her shoulders slightly tensing each time someone passed without so much as a glance in their direction. No one came to greet them, no one asked anything. It was a kind of refined disregard, impossible to call out, but equally impossible not to feel. Some turned away after catching Carter's gaze. Some simply never looked at him to begin with, as if, by not looking, he would cease to exist. Across the lawn, Sergeant Doug Harper, a white police officer in charge of funeral security, stood with a group of local officers, broad-shouldered, back straight, eyes constantly scanning as though waiting for a disruption. To Harper, the funeral was just a special shift, one that demanded total control. He didn't cry, didn't bow his head, didn't feel moved. Emotion, for him, was the most dangerous vulnerability in any security situation. And then he saw Carter, a black man in a crisply pressed uniform, standing still next to a young woman. As the flag was carried past, everyone around him placed a hand over their heart or bowed their heads. Except him. Carter just stood there, back straight, eyes unwavering, hands nowhere near his chest. A silent scene, but blinding to Harper's eyes. "Who's that guy?" Harper growled at the young officer beside him. "Why isn't he on the list of honored guests?" The officer fumbled with his clipboard. I'm not sure, but he's in full dress uniform with high-ranking medals. Could be a veteran?" Harper scoffed. "High-ranking? Slap on a hat and a few medals. And now he's a general?" He didn't know who Carter was, but the way the man stood, not bowing his head, not seeking anyone's eyes, irked him deeply. In Harper's world, everything had to follow a hierarchy, and respect was reserved for those who knew their place. But this man, that gaze, was quietly rejecting every structure Harper held sacred. And he didn't know yet that it was that raised head, that silence, that would strike the first spark into the fuel tank of prejudice smoldering inside him all his years on the force. Doug Harper didn't like people who made him feel small, especially if they weren't white. Within the police force, he was the textbook hard-to-approach officer. Strict, serious, by the book, but also someone who made new black recruits tread carefully. He didn't curse, he didn't hit. He simply had a habit of being suspicious at the right time, scrutinizing just the right details, and doing it all with an accuracy that was hard to challenge. On the surface, Harper didn't appear extreme, but beneath the shell of professionalism was an ego constantly afraid of anything out of control. To Harper, everything needed to be in order, from breath to gaze, and that morning, among hundreds of neatly uniformed people, only Michael Carter was out of place. He stood too straight. His eyes were too calm, his demeanor too unconcerned with recognition. And in Harper's world, anyone who doesn't need recognition is a threat. He moved slowly toward Zone A, where Carter stood, not rushed, but each step sliced through the grass. He said nothing to Carter, at least not yet. He merely raised a hand to his earpiece, switching to the internal command channel. His voice was low, cold. "We've got an unidentified individual in Zone A." There was a brief pause on the other end, then a young officer's hesitant voice. "The individual in a 4-star uniform, sir?" Harper didn't reply immediately. He studied Carter for a few more seconds, then answered, face unreadable. I don't care about the uniform. If anyone can throw that on and slip into a funeral, then it's our failure. That wasn't an instruction. It was a message, a warning broadcast to the entire security system in the area, that from this moment on, Carter was no longer a guest. He was a problem. To Harper, ceremony was merely a cover for latent risks. He didn't see death as sacred, just another situation ripe for loss of control. And people like Carter, needing no explanation, no verification, never stepping out of line, yet making the whole scene feel off-kilter, made him most uneasy. Deep down, Harper didn't believe himself to be racist. He just had reasonable suspicion. But that reasonable suspicion only ever seemed to arise when the person in front of him didn't share his skin color. And what infuriated him most, Carter hadn't done anything wrong, which is exactly why he had to find something wrong. Because if not, then the world Harper had believed in, protected, and upheld all these years might have been wrong from the start, and that he could not accept. Not now. Not in this solemn place. Not when he was the one in charge of security and standing before a man who, by all visible measures, was legitimate. Except for one thing, he was not afraid. Harper had never felt discomfort just from a man's gaze. He'd been stared down by drunks, threatened by protesters, insulted by lawyers, but never had a single look made him feel so small. Carter did nothing. He didn't speak, didn't frown, didn't advance, didn't retreat. He simply stood there, upright, silent, asking for no one's understanding. Yet the way he stood, the gaze that didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't drop, like a silent refusal carved from dignity, struck at the deepest part of Harper, the fear of being cast out of the order he had clung to all his life. To him, everything had a system: who stood where, who lowered their head and when, who had the right to speak. Everything belonged in a framework. And this man, a black man who did not bow his head when the flag passed, was breaking that order with nothing but silence. He stepped closer to Carter, not in a rush, but clearly with intention. Carter didn't move. His eyes weren't confrontational, weren't provocative, but there was something in them Harper couldn't name. He could only feel it. The man wasn't afraid. Not of him. Not of being misunderstood. Not of the system looming over this funeral. Harper tried to draw out some sign of weakness, a wavering glance, a twitch of posture, a flick of the hand, but there was nothing. Carter stood like a tree, and the more firmly he stood, the more Harper felt himself sway. For a man who lived by authority and order, that feeling was a direct punch to his pride. Inside Harper, a sharp and merciless inner dialogue erupted. He didn't salute the flag. He's not on the honor list. He looks at me like I'm not even there. But then another thought surfaced from deeper in his mind. Am I afraid of him? Harper clenched his jaw, knuckles whitening. No, that couldn't be. He was a cop. He had the authority. He protected safety, upheld order, and maintained ceremony. He couldn't let a black man, even one in uniform, make him feel small. No way. And in that moment, Harper didn't need agreement, didn't need evidence. He wrote the verdict in his head, subject for review. Not because Carter had done anything dangerous, but because he dared to exist without permission. Harper didn't do anything reckless, at least not yet. He knew exactly where he was. A military funeral, not a chaotic street where sirens and power could lash out like a whip. Here, there were ranks, rules, and cameras. One wrong move would cost him more than an apology. But Harper wasn't the kind to wait for the world to act. He was used to planting doubt like a virus, invisible, odorless, but quick to spread. He adjusted his earpiece slightly, switched channels, and spoke in a calm, routine tone. Unidentified subject, Area A. Monitor behavior. He didn't call Carter a suspect. He didn't press charges. He only told half the truth, just enough for the system to respond, for a few eyes to turn toward Carter, for the machine to move forward without question. No one challenged Harper. Everyone knew he was a man who didn't speak unnecessarily. But this time, it was the way he said less that did the most. Carter didn't need to hear every word to know the shift had begun. He was now surrounded by eyes that weren't looking by chance. He no longer carried a weapon, but he was still a soldier. And old scars don't live on skin. They live in instinct. They told him when the air changed, when glances were no longer random, and when a man in uniform was no longer doing his job, but hunting. Carter didn't turn, didn't speak, didn't walk away. He stood still, just as he had stood in the middle of battlefields with snipers hidden somewhere, waiting for the slightest move. Stillness wasn't fear, it was survival, knowing that any action could be twisted into the wrong reaction. Lily could feel it now. Something unnatural was unfolding. No one said a word, but the tension in the air was like glass on the verge of breaking. She leaned in gently and asked, in a worried voice, "Are you okay?" Carter kept his eyes on the flag-draped casket, where an old friend lay, in the middle of a country he had once bled to protect. After a long pause, he spoke softly. He survived Fallujah, Kandahar, even those briefing rooms where men decide who lives and who dies with a stroke of a pen. This he can endure. Lily said nothing more. She gripped his hand, not out of fear of Harper, but fear of the awful silence now swallowing the funeral. Carter understood. He didn't need to win right now. He only had to stand his ground and let the truth push the wrong man into the light. And Harper, by digging deeper into control, was stepping right onto the tripwire he had laid for himself. Lily was never good at enduring suffocating silence. The stillness in the cemetery wasn't peaceful. It was thick, cold, and stretched endlessly like a hold tone that never stopped. She looked around. No greetings, no smiles, not a single warm glance, just eyes that flicked quickly toward Carter, as if trying to place something that didn't fit the expected mold. When a young female officer, likely in charge of guest coordination, approached to check the seating chart, Lily seized the chance to break that terrifying silence. Tilting her head, she spoke softly, almost a whisper. "My grandfather is General Michael Carter. He used to command in Mosul. He's here for Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, an old comrade." There was no boast in her voice. It was the quiet affirmation of someone who needed to say, "We belong here." The officer paused. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise, but that was quickly replaced by a subtle nod and a slight bow. It was unclear whether out of protocol or instinct. She didn't ask questions, didn't check the list. She simply walked away, leaving behind a small, empty space and a sentence that refused to vanish into the wind. Not far off, Harper leaned against the iron fence enclosing the funeral zone, like a sentry, quietly directing an invisible formation. His eyes never left Area A, where Carter stood, unmoving, like a pillar untouched by the breeze. He hadn't heard Lily's full sentence, but the last three words hung in the air: General, Mosul, Comrade, and struck him like a directive in need of verification. The name Carter sounded familiar, but it wasn't on the special guest list. Harper was sure of it. He had personally reviewed every file before the event. In his mind, logic started twisting reality. If this was a four-star general, why wasn't he announced? Why didn't he appear in the military notes from the reception office? And, most importantly, why was someone of such high rank so silent, so unnoticeable? Harper didn't need an answer. With the instinct of someone who lives off suspicion, he never believed in coincidences. He only believed in the logic he constructed. If a man in a high-ranking uniform shows up unannounced, there are only two possibilities: either an oversight or someone trying to blend in. And in Harper's worldview, ruled by lists, procedures, and control, the second option always made more sense and was easier to act on. He didn't need to verify the background. He didn't ask for command confirmation. Just a scattered bit of information was enough for him to build a case, and now he had it. A girl's quiet statement, harmless on the surface, was twisted by Harper into his first piece of evidence, impersonating a senior officer with unknown intent. Harper needed no validation. He didn't reopen records, didn't consult the command center, didn't report up the chain like a standard officer would. He didn't need to. In his mind, the name Michael Carter was already labeled, and what remained were just procedural steps. He built a scenario, cast himself as a cautious leader, responding to a potential threat, when in truth he was coercing the system to see the world through his distorted lens. He grabbed the radio and issued his order, his voice deep and steady. "Possible impersonator. Check the uniform. Watch insignia on the left shoulder and chest. Subject may be using a false identity. No one objected. No one dared to ask why. His tone was too confident, too familiar in command. But it was that very calmness, the way he issued the command like it was the most righteous thing in the world, that made the order pure danger, a poison injected without warning. From that moment, the atmosphere among the security team shifted. A group of young officers suddenly adjusted their positions, closing in ever so slightly around Area A, where Carter still stood, unmoved, as if unaware of anything. They didn't overstep orders. They simply followed inspections. They glanced at him with a mix of respect and suspicion, like staring at a caged tiger. But in the quieter corners, another kind of reaction was taking shape. People who had family in the military, a father with battlefield scars, a sister who'd driven ambulances in Afghanistan, began to see Carter differently, not as a suspect, but as a deeply familiar figure, upright, unyielding, offering no explanation. They recognized that posture. It wasn't the posture of someone pretending, it was the bearing of someone who had walked the line between life and death without needing a badge to prove it. A Latino officer, standing beside the young cop from earlier, kept his eyes on Carter and muttered, "He's faking. He's doing a better job than anyone I've ever seen." The younger officer shook his head slightly. "He's not faking. He's just waiting for someone to realize he doesn't have to prove anything." That statement dropped like a quiet blade, slicing through the cold air of the funeral. But Harper didn't hear it. And even if he had, he wouldn't have cared. In his mind, there was only one goal now: erase Michael Carter's presence at all costs before anyone dared to address him by his true title. To Harper, that quiet existence, unapologetic, unbending, was the greatest threat to the order he knew, and that threat had to be eliminated. Here, now. The funeral reached its most solemn moment, the personal tribute. A voice echoed from the speakers, steady and slow like a heartbeat trying to stay balanced. Lieutenant Colonel Alan Reeves, enlisted in 1989, recognized for valor in Fallujah, the Mosul campaign, commanded Charlie Company, safeguarded forces at Kunduz Pass. Each name, each place, each mission was read out like a brief incision into a lifetime, wrapped in the word service. In front of the platform, two soldiers in Navy dress uniforms folded the American flag with solemn precision, each movement exact. A wooden tray was brought forward, silent, momentarily lit by a shaft of sunlight breaking through ancient oak branches. The air thickened, sacred, unified, with no more distinction of skin color, religion, or rank, and in that very moment, Carter stepped forward. Not fast, not slow, each step measured in memory, in blood, and the nights spent with his head beside fallen brothers. He didn't look at anyone, waited for no signal, walking straight toward the casket, where his final comrade lay. The way he moved wasn't showy, but he didn't ask permission either. It was the gait of someone who knew his right to be there wasn't about rank, but about history. Carter stood tall, placed his right hand to his chest, and slowly formed a salute, wrist bent at a perfect right angle, eyes fixed on the folded flag, as if he were staring into a part of his own life, now resting silently in that dark wooden box. Then a shout cracked through the air like a bullet. "Freeze! Hand down! Who are you?" The entire ceremony jolted. Gasps and screams followed. The sharp sounds of chaos burst behind them like shattered glass. Carter hadn't even lowered his salute when Harper lunged forward, wild, uncontrolled, the gun in his hands aimed straight at Carter's chest, both fists clenched tight, arms shaking, eyes full of fury. No one understood what was happening. Cries rippled through the crowd. A young soldier stumbled backward, nearly falling. White flowers fell from the memorial table, crushed under someone's panicked foot. No one could believe that at a soldier's funeral, surrounded by uniforms and medals, a gun would be pointed at the man who had just saluted in perfect military form. No one stopped Harper because no one yet grasped what they were seeing. No one stepped forward because no one believed it was real. Harper stood shaking, gun in hand, voice pressed into control. "Identify yourself. Hands behind your head. Now!" He barked like he was detaining a terrorist. But before him was no criminal, no threat. Just an old man standing firm in the ruins of a sacred ritual. Carter didn't flinch. His hand still hovered at his side from the salute, but his eyes now met Harper's, not the flag's. No words, no fear, no defense, just presence. So composed it made Harper blink rapidly, as if unsure whether he'd just violated something irrevocable. The gun trembled in Harper's grip. No one moved to back him, but no one moved to stop him either. The air froze in place, just a weathered soldier standing tall, and a police officer cracking under the weight of his own authority. Harper shouted again, voice faltering, "Last warning! Hands behind your head! Identify yourself!" Carter didn't budge. He didn't obey. He didn't protest. He simply stood, as if Harper and the gun didn't exist. That silence unraveled Harper. He was used to fear, to apologize, to resist. Carter gave him nothing. And then Harper noticed he was being watched, not just by Carter, but by dozens of others, soldiers, veterans, families, and none of them were looking at the old man. They were all looking at him. A veteran in a gray suit, a purple heart pinned to his chest, leaned to whisper, "You just pointed a gun at a general." No one laughed, no one gasped, but like a silent wave, truth spread, no need for a loudspeaker or badge. Carter's posture alone made the entire ceremony shift. Harper began to realize he was on the wrong side, not because someone told him so, but because Carter's stillness held up a mirror he couldn't escape. Lily stepped forward to speak, but Carter gently shook his head. He didn't need defending. He didn't need anyone to speak for him. The more he stood silent, the more everyone else had to examine themselves. And for Harper, that was the sharpest blow. The gun in his hand was no longer a symbol of law. It had become evidence of his mistake. And worse, everyone had seen it. The wind brushed gently through the rows of flags. The American flag above the memorial fluttered slightly, making a sound so faint no one could hear it. Yet in that moment, it felt like the only sound left on earth. Everything froze. Those seated stood in unison. A few young soldiers reached for their rifles, unsure what to do next. Carter remained still, motionless, like a part of the granite beneath him. He didn't blink, didn't step. Harper's gun was still aimed, but his eyes wavered, his certainty torn by something he couldn't name. Confusion. He no longer knew what he was protecting or fighting. And as that first flicker of doubt took root, truth shattered the silence like glass. "Put the weapon down, Sergeant. That man is General Michael Carter." The voice wasn't loud, but it rang with authority. The crowd turned. A woman in high-ranking military dress uniform stepped forward from the officers' row, cap secured per regulation, colonel insignia shining on her left shoulder. Her stride was firm, her eyes sharp, meant not for debate, but to establish fact. Everyone heard the name, Michael Carter, and those who knew it froze. Silence cut through the space like a blade. Carter didn't respond. He didn't nod, didn't speak. He stood as though the name needed no confirmation, because he had lived it, and spoken by a colonel, with no ID, no documents, no credentials. His name alone became proof. Harper stiffened, his grip tightened, but his shoulders sagged. Before him stood not a suspect, but something he couldn't control, honor. Phones rose in the crowd, some live-streamed, hands shaking. Some were filmed from the side. Some just looked at their screens, as if to confirm the moment was real. In those clips, a black general, upright at a comrade's funeral, held at gunpoint by another in uniform. No one yelled racism. They didn't need to. The image spoke for itself. Carter commanded in Mosul. He holds the Distinguished Service Cross. He doesn't need to prove a damn thing, the colonel declared. Her voice no longer explained, it led. Each word struck like a drumbeat, forcing truth into the open. Nearby officers nodded, not out of doubt, but because they felt a sting in their chest, realizing how close they had come to staying silent. The name Michael Carter wasn't new. It had appeared in strategic reports, memoirs, and war stories told across barracks, but time, prejudice, and a system that selectively remembers had made people forget the most crucial thing. Honor doesn't need resizing to fit new eyes. Harper lowered the gun as if his arm no longer belonged to him. It twitched, then stilled, trembling. His body malfunctioned. Not from being struck, but from realizing he had spiritually pulled the trigger on the wrong man. Before he could speak, two MPs in sleek black uniforms approached. One touched his shoulder, the other raised a hand, placed the weapon down. No shouting, no threats, because in that moment authority was no longer his. He wasn't cuffed, he wasn't escorted away, but his power was gone, stripped by hundreds of silent witnesses. No one called him sir, no one defended him, because they knew. Defending him now would mean being complicit in something inexcusable. Carter still didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stood tall, shoulders relaxed, eyes fixed on the flag. From beginning to end, he hadn't defended himself with words, but with presence, a steady pillar around which others' errors revealed themselves. No one stood beside him, yet the entire space leaned toward him, and those who once doubted, who kept distance, who stayed silent, now only felt shame for having looked without truly seeing. Behind the podium, the officiant's voice returned, trying to continue. His tone trembled, emotions barely restrained. Lieutenant Colonel Alan Reeves served 28 years, honored for defending his unit under siege. The script remained unchanged, but the air weighed heavier, because among those lines of valor, not a single one said the final comrade to salute him was held at gunpoint during the service, and no one would dare write it, because today's truth would write itself into the memory of everyone who was there. The tension hadn't yet fully settled when the sound of footsteps echoed, firm, not loud, but steady. A young officer, average in build, hair cropped close, face still carrying hints of hesitation, but eyes cold in their clarity, stepped out from the police formation. He removed his cap, held it in his hand, shoulders squared, chest open, as though bearing the weight of the silence for everyone. This was Officer Bradley, Harper's direct partner, who had been standing behind him the whole time, his eyes constantly scanning, as if searching for the truth between two opposing sides. He walked a few paces forward and stopped in front of Carter. He didn't salute, didn't bow, but the way he stood, firm and upright, was its own silent tribute. Then he turned to face the crowd and spoke, not loudly, but with a steadiness that hushed every other sound around him. "I was with Sergeant Harper from the start of this shift, and I saw everything." That single sentence, just 6 words, pierced through the crowd's waiting silence, a silence held up like a wall until someone dared to say something unmistakable. People began to shift. Some looked up. Some gripped the shoulders of those beside them. Some raised their phones, not to keep filming, but to record every word that followed. This funeral had long ceased to be a formal ceremony. It had become a moral reckoning, unfolding through action, and Bradley, without yelling, without quoting the law, had forced everyone to face what they had already seen, the truth. Harper stumbled forward, startled, voice cracking like someone trying to trade rage for justification. "Bradley, you know me. I meant no harm. I was just following protocol. You have to tell them, you have to say something to explain to me." Bradley turned to look straight at the man who had once been his superior, but now stood as someone painfully alone, realizing no one stood with him anymore. His voice was steady, low, but unyielding. "No, sir. You didn't follow protocol. You chose to act without verifying. You abused your power. You chose bias over justice." Then he turned back to Carter, not with a salute, but with a bow. A gesture not of formality, but of respect. "I'm sorry, General Carter. I've been silent for too long. But today, No one will be forced to stay silent to protect someone else's pride. After those words, a long-taut silence stretched over the funeral until it finally snapped. A middle-aged woman in a neat black dress stood up from the third row. Her sunglasses were pushed up into her salt and pepper hair, and she held her phone in one hand. Without a microphone, without invitation, she raised the phone high and said, calmly but firmly, "I have a video I filmed from the moment he walked up. He didn't do anything. Just stood and saluted. No one asked her to prove it. No one doubted her. Her gaze and the steadiness in her steps made it clear this was no longer about one man. It was no longer just between Harper and Carter. This was something everyone had seen, and this time, no one was willing to stay quiet. A retired soldier, thin but still standing tall, rose after her. A 101st Airborne badge gleamed on his chest. He didn't introduce himself. He simply said, "I served under General Carter in Iraq." No name tag needed, no proof necessary. The way he saluted, nobody could fake that. Then a uniformed officer, part of the ceremonial guard near the casket, suddenly stepped forward and said, "I don't know General Carter, but a soldier who doesn't bow to a rifle and doesn't blink when insulted isn't a fraud." Then a young man in a black hoodie, probably a guest of someone's family, raised his phone, his hands trembling slightly. "I've been live streaming since 9:05. The whole thing's here. You can watch it. No one caused trouble. No one resisted. Just one man stepped forward to honor his friend, and one man pulled a gun. There was no defense. No chanting, no riot, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Right and wrong were no longer dictated from above. They became a conclusion reached by a community that had seen and now chose to acknowledge. Carter remained where he was. He didn't look surprised. He didn't get emotional. He simply nodded as if he had always known that the truth didn't need to shout to be seen. Bradley stood a few steps away, still holding his cap, his eyes moving from one speaker to the next. Every voice was a nail in the coffin of collective silence, the silence that had long protected men like Harper. This was no longer a ceremony. It had become a quiet hearing, where the dead could no longer speak, but the living had decided the truth would not be buried with them. Less than 6 hours after the funeral at Arlington, the first video began to spread across social media. No edits, no narration, no clickbait, just a 1-minute, 32-second clip. A black man in full military dress saluting a flag-draped casket when a white police officer suddenly drew his gun, shouted, and aimed straight at his chest. No explanation. No reason, just the image so stark no words could justify it. By midday, what started as a random video on Twitter had reappeared across Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Reddit. Viewers didn't need to ask, "Who is he?" The look in his eyes as he faced the gun told them enough. This was not a man who bowed. That was all it took. The wave began. Veterans spoke up first. Those who had served in Iraq, Kosovo, Somalia. Some recalled seeing Carter's name in command briefings. Others said he was the quiet legend who always chose service over spotlight. Military forums opened threads about the Arlington funeral, the Carter incident. In one private veterans group, a post gathered over 20,000 shares in just 4 hours. Then politicians joined, not because of Carter's fame, but because public outrage had grown impossible to ignore. Tweets rolled in from Virginia lawmakers, Pentagon advisors, members of the Veterans Affairs Committee. A gun was aimed at the honor of thousands who served in silence. No one is allowed to use procedure to disgrace sacrifice. One by one, excuses were stripped away. For once, no one mentioned context, job, stress, or split-second reaction. Just one thing was said, over and over. This was inexcusable, especially in front of a flag-draped coffin. At 4:34 p.m., the Department of Defense released its first official statement, promising an independent investigation and accountability at the highest level. By then, General Carter had become the top trending hashtag across every major platform. News outlets from CNN and MSNBC to Al Jazeera broadcast constant updates. Some stopped calling it the Arlington incident and instead called it what it was, a serious breach of military protocol. One global news network ran a headline so stark It stunned viewers. One funeral, one gun, and a nation forced to reconsider how it sees skin color under a uniform. No one spoke of Carter as a lone victim anymore. He had become a mirror, reflecting a country that prides itself on tradition, honor, and ceremony, yet allowed a man who once bled for it to have a gun pointed at his chest while saying goodbye to a fallen brother. Less than 36 hours after the funeral at Arlington, an emergency hearing was convened, not at a government headquarters, not in a town hall, but inside Fort Myers Barracks, less than a mile from the cemetery. The location was not chosen for convenience, but for symbolism. Once a training ground for officers, now a place to question the very honor they were trained to uphold. The panel included a representative from the Department of Defense, 2 senior military attorneys, a general ranking officer, and a temporary civilian appointee from Congress. The center chair, plain, without emblems or decoration, was reserved for Harper. He was summoned without fanfare, prohibited from wearing his uniform, and assigned no personal security. For the first time in nearly 2 decades of service, no one addressed him as Sir. He sat with his hands clamped tightly on his knees, eyes lowered, sweat beading on his temples. The questions were delivered by the presiding officer, short, sharp, and precise as blades. Do you confirm that you drew your weapon and aimed it at an individual conducting a military memorial salute? Were you aware at the time that this individual was General Michael Carter? Why did you not perform any form of identification or verification before acting? Harper could only swallow hard. He tried to invoke suspicion, tense conditions, an unscheduled ritual unfamiliar to protocol, but the more he spoke, the more obvious his deflection became. The panel didn't interrupt. They let him tie the noose with his own evasions. Then the first witness stepped in. Officer Bradley, uniform, sharp, cap in hand, posture flawless. He stood at attention, speaking without hesitation. I was present during the entire ceremony. General Carter displayed no threatening behavior. There were no signs of concern. It was his composed presence that triggered Sergeant Harper's reaction, not danger but bias. Next came a female colonel, the one who had called Carter by name in front of hundreds frozen in confusion. Carter was my direct superior in Mosul. We buried 19 comrades together. If he isn't allowed to honor them, none of us deserves to wear this uniform anymore. Each testimony struck like a hammer against the already fractured foundation of the local police system. But then, another document surfaced. Not from the funeral, not from that day. A personnel file from the Arlington Police Department, an internal complaint about Harper from 4 years earlier. Handwritten, in plain language, the script is slightly uneven. The complainant was a black schoolteacher, stopped by Harper while taking his child to school, allegedly because his face didn't match the car registration. In the complaint, the teacher wrote, "He didn't yell, he didn't strike me, he just kept asking the same question, 'Are you sure you're the one this car is registered to?' As if my skin color made the car suspicious." The report was never processed. The original reviewing officer was Lieutenant Paul Myers, Harper's direct supervisor at the time. A handwritten note at the bottom of the page, smudged red ink, read, "Handled internally, no record kept, to avoid setting personnel precedent." The hearing room fell into complete silence. A Justice Department representative turned the page. 2 more complaints, one from a single mother whose purse was searched for no reason while buying baby formula, resembled someone with an active warrant. Each complaint had ended the same way. No sufficient evidence, no action taken. Harper turned pale. He leaned toward his military attorney and whispered, "I thought these were sealed." The attorney didn't answer. He sat upright, fingers laced, staring straight at the panel, as if he too had just realized he had defended the wrong man. The panel didn't deliver a sentence immediately, but a directive was signed that same night. Harper was suspended from all duties, stripped of access to police and military systems, and placed under investigation under Category 3, abuse of power, violation of military protocol, and dishonoring a senior officer. More quietly, but more heavily, came a second order, a full review of all complaints filed within the past 10 years at the Arlington Police Department, with a special directive that all previously dismissed cases citing insufficient grounds be reevaluated by an independent third party. Outside the barracks, twilight had fallen. Carter never appeared. He didn't sit in the courtroom. He didn't speak into a microphone. But everyone knew the floor beneath Harper's chair was cast in the shadow of the man he once tried to step over. And the greatest irony was this: Carter's silence became the loudest voice in the room. No additional weapons needed to be raised to escalate the situation further. It was the old case files and the once closed internally annotations that truly exploded the long-held illusions surrounding Harper. After an emergency hearing, a group of independent journalists and human rights attorneys began to comb through his entire administrative record. From there, a chain of evidence came to light, not through tricks, but through the persistent presence of truths that someone had once tried to bury. In 2013, Harper was reported for yelling at a black high school student simply because the boy walked too close to a patrol car. The report read, Harper loudly threatened to send the boy to a juvenile facility if he kept messing with official property. There was no visual evidence, but that student, now a medical worker, recounted the event in a viral post. I don't remember the color of the car, but I remember his eyes, like I had no legal right to exist on that sidewalk. 7 months later, Harper was again accused of shoving a black college student during a peaceful protest in West Square. The report mentioned minor scuffling, but didn't specify who initiated it. When asked why he used force, Harper said, I saw someone unfamiliar moving fast. That quote caused little reaction at the time, but 10 years later, it became a key to identifying a behavioral pattern, repeated yet always labeled differently. The deeper they dug, the clearer the system became. It wasn't just Harper. Behind every no action taken, internal warning, or reassignment lay familiar signatures, from mid-level staff to HR directors. A leaked Excel sheet revealed that over his 15-year career, Harper accumulated 23 misconduct complaints related to black citizens, none of which were formally recorded. Meanwhile, those who filed complaints, mostly from minority communities, were labeled uncooperative, unverifiable, or accused of unclear motives. The press began calling it a systemic silence loop where wrongdoing wasn't hidden by violence, but by procedures that appeared legitimate. No one punched justice in the face. They simply taped blank paper over its eyes and nodded. The following week, a closed-door meeting was held at the Department of Justice with representatives from human rights commissions, Congress, the Army Inspector General, and the National Internal Affairs Oversight Committee. There, for the first time in years, a formal proposal was tabled to transfer disciplinary power over law enforcement misconduct from Police Internal Affairs to an interagency civilian congressional oversight board. Once dismissed as impractical, unrealistic, or administratively disruptive, the proposal now received unanimous support. Meanwhile, at Arlington, pressure hadn't subsided. The sitting police chief was asked to step down temporarily. The city's chief legal counsel resigned 3 days after her name appeared on waiver memos bypassing investigations. The state police office opened a direct community response portal, and within 48 hours, over 2,000 emails, hundreds of calls, and a long list of volunteer witnesses had come in. For the first time in years, the phrase transferred from district to state level wasn't used to delay, but to initiate real processing. No one defended Harper anymore. But more frightening was this: those who once stayed silent about Harper were now being named. A retired officer who closed the 2017 case was investigated. A former city administrator, now a Senate candidate, was forced to face media questions for ignoring a petition from a mother whose son was detained by Harper for 12 hours without cause. The system could no longer wash its hands because public opinion, media, veteran groups, civil rights lawyers, and everyday citizens had pieced together each wrong into a clear figure a chain of cover-ups made legitimate through bureaucratic language. Carter remained silent. He made no posts, gave no interviews, and appeared in no footage. But his name appeared in every investigative file, every policy recommendation, every transparency campaign for law enforcement reform. In a quote from a West Point symposium, a professor said, "There's nothing more painful than watching a soldier hold a salute when facing the gun of someone who claims to protect." But it was that composure that forced us all to stand. The hearing had grown more intense than ever. Representatives from the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, Congress, and the press were all present. People were expecting a wave of witnesses, those who would name names and strike at the long-buried core of misconduct. They braced for a public reckoning, a verbal storm where every sentence would cut into corruption like a blade. But no one expected the first person to step forward would be Michael Carter. No bodyguards, no entourage, no insignia, just an elderly man walking slowly, his left hand holding a pair of slightly wrinkled white gloves, shoulders squared, dressed in a simple gray suit, no uniform, no medals. He didn't need a ceremony to be recognized. No one announced his name, no one led him in, but everyone in the room stood up as he entered. Not by protocol, not by command, but as a reflex when decency walked through the door. Pens were lowered. Glasses were removed. Some looked down, as if unsure whether their own gaze was worthy of meeting the presence of a man they had never truly understood. When invited to speak, Carter didn't step onto the raised podium. He declined the wired microphone, choosing instead to stand in the center of the room, where even the floor beneath seemed to be listening. He didn't speak of the gun pointed at him. He didn't mention Harper. He didn't recount the interrupted ceremony at Arlington. Instead, he began with a memory free of bitterness. "I had a friend, Alan Reeves. We were stuck together for 3 days in an unnamed village outside Mosul. We had no ammo, no signal. The only thing left was the sound of each other breathing, to know we were still alive." The room fell into a silence that couldn't be defined. It wasn't the tension of judgment or the stiffness of scrutiny. It was the kind of silence that comes when people realize they're hearing someone speak from a heart that had survived more than its share of moments without a final word. Carter's voice was even, gentle, without any attempt to force emotion. And that, more than any accusation, made his words land deeper than 1,000 indictments. Alan wasn't the bravest. He wasn't the best shot, but he knew how to stay calm when no one else could. Once, I asked him why he never raised his voice. He said, "Because some things shrink when you speak them out loud." Carter paused. Not long, but long enough for everyone in the room to take measure of themselves. He looked down at the gloves in his hands, then up again, his gaze not fixed on anyone in particular, yet touching everyone at once. "I'm not angry at the man who pointed the gun at me, because that man didn't see me, and he couldn't hear what I chose not to say." He stopped, and this time he said nothing more. No appeal, no conclusion, but in that moment no one in the room dared speak, because anything said after that would have felt unnecessary. After Carter's final words, the room stayed quiet for a long while, long enough to make even the most hardened feel short of breath. No one knew whether his speech had ended or if he was merely pausing. But no one dared interrupt. Those who had written defenses of the system, who had explained away misconduct as occupational pressure, who had dodged the word racism with softer phrases, now found themselves mute. Not because they were accused, but because they had been seen through by a man who didn't need to say more for them to be forced to face themselves. In the quiet, one member of the council, the head of Internal Conduct Review, slowly put down her pen. She had once supported light reform, had opposed transferring disciplinary powers outside the department, and had argued in a closed meeting that Harper's actions do not represent the whole force. But now, she was the first to rise from her chair, walking slowly to the auxiliary podium. She tapped the mic and spoke a single sentence, one that appeared in no agenda, no transcript. "We've written many procedures, but none of them teach us how to face dignity." No applause followed, but the way eyes shifted in the room was unmistakable. They were no longer looking for someone to blame. They were turning inward, a quiet shift, like an underground stream, changing course after a silent earthquake. And then people began to speak, not to argue, but to affirm what they had seen and chosen to ignore. A data analyst admitted he had flagged nearly 20 behavioral complaints against Harper, but was not allowed to name him directly. A retired police chief submitted a public letter stating that, if he were still in charge, "I'm not sure I'd have had the courage to stand by Carter the way he stood by others." A local journalist who had interviewed Harper in 2017 and published a glowing profile titled "The Enforcer of Order" rewrote the entire article, keeping the photo but replacing every word beginning with "I looked, but I didn't see," and "I wrote, but it wasn't true." No one was asked to do this, but Carter, through silence, through not demanding justice but reminding others of dignity, had made it impossible for people to go on living without doing what was right, not because they were forced to, but because not doing so had become unbearable. Some hearings are held to seek answers. Others exist to make those who once deflected confront what everyone else already saw. That day's hearing was the second one that week, called urgently by the U.S. Attorney's Office to present preliminary findings from field data, a diplomatic way of saying vague words were about to be stripped bare by the cold clarity of recorded images. The federal prosecutor, a white man in his early 50s, tall, calm, with a measured tone, didn't begin with a dramatic statement. He started with a question. Does anyone here believe that a 4-star general in full uniform, saluting the national flag on a casket, is a threat? No one answered. He didn't wait. His hand moved across the digital screen. A video played, uncut, silent, unedited, 47 seconds from a live stream recorded by a funeral guest. Every motion was clear. Carter removing his hat, placing a hand over his heart, then raising it in salute. Flawless military precision. Nothing more, nothing less. Then Harper entered the frame from the left, shouting, "Freeze!" as he ran, gun raised and trembling. The prosecutor paused the footage right at the frame where Carter stood still, eyes fixed on the flag, while Harper's gun was already aimed. Turning back to the room, his voice remained steady. "We gathered 5 independent recordings and 1 internal audio clip from the comms channel. No one in the organizing committee issued an order to intervene. No security alert was reported by military personnel. There were 0 warnings of a suspicious subject in Area A. The only justification Harper cited for drawing his weapon was personal instinct." He paused, then continued. "And when instinct alone becomes the basis for pulling a gun, the legal system can no longer call that within protocol." Harper sat below, his face draining of color. He didn't look up. His left hand clenched, his right hand trembled, as if grasping for something to hold on to, a reason, an excuse. But the more he shook, the further those vanished, the defenses he had prepared about professional reflexes and possible impersonation had no ground left to stand on. Every frame, every line of the report only reaffirmed what Carter had never needed to say aloud, that truth doesn't need defending when it's already whole. The prosecutor moved to the next slide. Radio signal graphs, gate surveillance, guest list reports, all aligned. Carter had entered on time, through the proper checkpoint, with an official invitation in full uniform, accompanied by his legal guardian, his granddaughter. Nothing flagged him as suspicious except his skin. Harper didn't act on information. He acted on assumption. And that assumption, rooted in a recurring pattern, we can now prove is not an isolated incident, but a chain of behavior shaped by personal bias. No one argued. No hands raised. No one needed convincing. Harper began to collapse. Not by shouting, not by breaking down or slamming fists, but through the quiet retreat of his gaze from the present. He stopped looking at anyone, not at the prosecutor, not at his own attorney, not at the evidence screens. He just stared at his hands, as if trying to pinpoint the exact moment he lost the ability to tell a real threat from the shadows of his own making. A review officer read out the final report, testimony from 3 young officers on Harper's team, including Bradley. Each had been questioned separately. All confirmed they heard no security alert from organizers. One even hand-wrote a line, "I was there. All I saw General Carter do was stand straight." Harper's real exposure wasn't in pointing the gun. It was in what happened after, when everyone had seen the truth and no one stood by him. A man once shielded by authority, protected by the claim of strict discipline, now faced the one moment no protocol could cover, the moment no one else stepped in to speak for him, and in that silent panic, with no space left for tears, only one thing remained: emptiness. The prosecutor didn't end with the harsh verdict. He simply said, "We don't ask for remorse. We ask for a system where those entrusted with power no longer believe they are the standard of suspicion." Then he sat down. No one said a word, and in that room, Carter remained silent. He didn't need to speak. The reasoning had already been spoken, and what was right had never left. When the name Carla Jenkins was called, a strange wave of silence swept through the room. No one clapped, no one filmed. But the anticipation was visible in every gaze. Carla, a lieutenant who had directly supervised Harper for 3 years on the field control unit, walked up with steady steps, shoulders firm, eyes straight. She wore no badge. Her collar was unbuttoned, just a black woman in a pale gray shirt, sitting down like someone about to unload a burden no one had asked her to carry. When asked about her time working with Harper, Carla didn't respond immediately. She looked down at her clasped hands. 1 beat, 2. On the 3rd, she spoke, softly, as though afraid her voice might shatter something fragile. "I used to think Harper was just hot-tempered." A breath. "I saw him yell in the face of a black father asking about his son held in the interrogation room. I saw him shove a file aside and say, 'People like that are all the same anyway.'" Her eyes weren't looking at anyone, but the entire room seemed to bow their heads. A man in the 4th row, a state legislator, quietly pulled out a tissue, though his face was dry. A clerk nearby stopped typing. The silence hung heavy, thick between each unspoken punctuation in Carla's story. "I called it a personality issue. I thought I could balance things out if I managed him well enough. I believed my coldness could neutralize his fire, but no one can contain someone the system insists on keeping." She paused. That sentence, quietly delivered, pierced through the thin veil of denial many in the room had wrapped themselves in. One council member leaned forward, hands clasped near their mouth. Further back, a policewoman whispered something to her partner, who nodded but didn't dare look up. Carla lifted her head. This time, her eyes didn't flinch. I stayed silent, not because I feared Harper, but because I was tired. Tired of being the only black person in the briefing room who kept having to remind everyone that a white officer's word shouldn't be assumed true just because it's typed in Times New Roman at the top of a report. Her voice remained calm, but every word carried a weight not easily digested. I used to think I was different from him, but today, sitting here, I'm not so sure, because I know if the man who had a gun pointed at him hadn't been a general, but just another ordinary black man, no cameras, no outrage, I probably would have stayed quiet too. That sentence stung, especially those still trying to believe this wasn't their fault. The silence turned uneasy, not from the lack of sound, but from too many people hearing their own thoughts spoken aloud. The next to speak was Marcus, a young officer seated near the back, who hesitated, as if still hoping someone else would rise in his place. He stepped forward slowly, carrying only a quarter-folded sheet of paper, its edges wrinkled from being gripped too often. Marcus didn't stand as straight as Carla. His posture slumped slightly. Dark circles framed his eyes. His face betrayed all the tension he couldn't hide. When asked to speak, he didn't answer immediately. He simply held up the paper and said, "I'd like to read." Then, in a hoarse voice pressed tight by a throat that seemed to resist every word, he read, "I wrote this in 2019 after a shift with Harper. That day we detained a black boy. No real reason, just said he looked like someone with a warrant. Harper checked his backpack, tore his books, searched his wallet, then laughed. I stood there. I did nothing. I didn't report it. He paused. There was something breaking behind his eyes. Not tears exactly, but the realization of an irreversible failure. I wasn't threatened. I wasn't forced. I just didn't have the courage. I thought if I stay silent, I can survive in this job, and I did survive. But now I know surviving doesn't mean your hands are clean. Someone in the back row bent over, hand covering their face. Others took out their phones, not to record, but to avoid the eyes of those around them. Something in the room had begun to shift, like the final tremor of a building before it leans fully into collapse. And in the front row, Carter remained seated, unbowed, still, but his gaze absent of blame was what made it hardest for some to escape their own shame. In the heavy air, thick as waterlogged wood, where confessions no longer felt like outliers, the back doors of the room opened slowly. A man in his 60s stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, but with uncertain steps. He wore a dark suit, a white shirt, and no tie, yet everyone recognized him. Lewis K. Mathers, former Deputy Director of State Internal Affairs, retired general, once hailed as the architect of iron discipline during Virginia law enforcement's highest enforcement era. No one had expected him. For the past week, his name had appeared in report after report tied to Harper Sentra. He had signed off on case closures, marked complaints unsubstantiated, left his red signature at the bottom of every discarded grievance. The media had assumed he would stay away, because he didn't have to show up. But then, he did, without warning, without legal counsel, alone, and as he entered titleless, the entire room seemed to brace itself, as if a former pillar of power had returned, not to shield the system, but to confront its wreckage. Mathers offered no greetings. He didn't ask to speak. He sat, quietly lacing his fingers together, gaze neither proud nor pleased. When asked why he had come, his answer dropped like stones into a dry well. I'm here to confirm. I knew Harper was wrong. I saw the complaints. That I read them. And that I chose to ignore them. No sound followed. Even the stenographer paused. Mathers continued, his voice steady, but heavy with every remembered beat. In 2017, I received 3 separate reports. One about excessive force during a student search, one about unlawfully holding a citizen beyond legal time, one about racial slurs used during duty. All were clear, all had witnesses. But I looked at the arrest numbers. I saw the unit's stats, and I signed not to investigate. He didn't say, I was under pressure. He didn't say, I didn't know. He offered no politics, no excuse that everyone did it, and that made the moment heavier than any speech could. A young officer in the back leaned forward, hand clenched as if holding back breath. A legal aide lowered her head. Carter, still at the front, did not move, but he never took his eyes off Mathers. It wasn't a look of accusation, but it wasn't forgiveness either. Mathers slowly pulled a yellowed copy of an old complaint from his jacket pocket. The handwriting was still clear. He placed it on the table like a living piece of evidence. Then he said, back then, I thought part of my job was to protect the capable from nuisances. I called to complain about nuisance. I called citizens' data. I called officers like Harper indispensable. He didn't cry, but no one needed him to. His presence, marked by a plain, honest, and devastatingly late confession, was enough to make others, still clinging to distance, begin to feel the floor beneath them tremble. Something in the system was starting to sink, not because it was attacked, but because those who once held it up had finally stepped away. Before leaving the table, Mathers didn't apologize, but he turned to Carter, a man he had never met, and spoke like a soldier reporting to a commander after a failed retreat. I don't expect your forgiveness. I only hope you won't stay silent the way I did. Carter didn't reply, but the slow, deep nod he gave, utterly free of malice, was heavier than any sentence that might follow. On sentencing day, Washington's sky offered neither rain nor sun, just a thin layer of haze, as if the city itself was shielding its emotions from what was about to unfold. The federal court session was held in a neutral courtroom. No flags, no flowers, No live broadcast cameras. No one wore ceremonial uniforms. Court officers were unarmed, not because they weren't cautious, but because this was no longer an administrative proceeding. It was a place where the concept of accountability had to show its true face. Doug Harper entered the courtroom like a shadow drained of memory. His ash-gray civilian suit made him blend into the background, as if the color itself reflected the fading outline of his purpose. He wasn't handcuffed, no criminal conviction yet, but his walk resembled that of someone already judged by the gaze of others long ago. He looked at no one, not at Carter, not at the former colleagues who once backed him. Harper, who once believed he stood firm inside the strongest system, now belonged to none. On the high bench, the judge had been chosen not for optics, but for the rare symmetry of military experience and legal clarity. No flowing robe, hair tied back, left hand steady on a folder, and just her eyes were enough to hush the room like still water waiting for a stone. No grand openings, no proclamations of historic moments. She simply read the sentence, each word precise and cold, like the steel from which military honor is forged. Defendant Doug Harper, former officer overseeing local security forces, is found to have intentionally drawn and aimed a weapon at a high-ranking service member during an official United States military funeral ceremony. No one stirred. The words, though expected, still hit like a hammer on stone, long thought too hard to crack. This act not only violated military protocol, but constituted an armed threat against a superior within the military framework, severely compromising the dignity of the armed forces, national honor, and public trust in law enforcement. Someone in the third row shifted, exhaling, not in relief, but as if truth had finally been addressed by the voice of an institution. Based on visual evidence, witness testimony, internal data, and verified complaints, the court hereby revokes all ranks and entitlements held by Doug Harper relating to law enforcement. A pause. This case will also be transferred to the Office of Military Prosecution for indictment under Article 115 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Armed threat against a senior officer during execution of a national ceremonial duty. The word national echoed like a bell tapped gently on a coffin lid, not for the dead, but for an ideology that had lived too long in the dark. No one clapped. Carter sat motionless. Harper looked down, not in collapse, but in recognition that, from now on, light would never shine from his direction again. There were no cheers, no weeping, no cries of justice as in courtroom dramas. When the gavel fell, 3 firm, decisive strikes, the room only grew quieter, as if all emotion had already been spent, and now only acceptance remained. No one celebrated justice being served, because this time justice came at the price of a bitter truth. It hadn't arrived when it should have. Harper didn't bow his head, didn't cry, but his eyes drifted as if unsure whether he was still in a real courtroom or inside the final hallucination of lost power. His slight hunch, his staggering step as he rose, resembled a statue just removed from its pedestal, still not understanding why. When 2 court officers approached, he did not resist, no protest, no one to seek help from. He stood as though performing the final act of a play whose audience had quietly left long ago. No one looked at him with pity, but no one looked at him with hatred either, because now Harper was no longer anything except the last name in the thickest file of publicly exposed abuse of power. Carter still said nothing. He hadn't come to witness anyone's downfall. No triumphant look, no sigh of relief. He came as a final witness to confirm that silence, when placed in the right context, carries more weight than 100 declarations. When the judge adjourned the session, he rose and walked out from his row, back straight, each step as if precisely measured against the floor, not fast, not slow, but steady, as if to say he had lived long enough to know there are victories that should never be cheered. And as he passed Harper, being led away, neither man looked at the other, not out of contempt, but because sometimes truth needs no gaze, only the space to be seen at last. Outside, The sky remained gently gray, no rain, no sun, just the half-light of a winter day shifting seasons. The trees stirred, not from wind, but with the motion of invisible empathy. Reporters stood at the gate, none daring to press forward. It took photos from a distance, no zoom lenses, no microphones thrust into faces, because today, no one wants to break the silence that restored one man's dignity and unmasked an entire system. After all this, Carter didn't leave in a government vehicle. He climbed into an old civilian car, paint faded, windows scratched, where Lily waited in the passenger seat. Her eyes were soft but anxious, not out of fear for his sorrow, but because she understood. Silence in a man like him isn't peace, but a lesson. When he opened the door and sat down, the air in the car didn't fill, it deepened. He spoke only once, not to conclude, but to affirm the single truth his life had been shaped around. Someday, if they ask why I wasn't angry, tell them it's because I chose to keep my right hand open to salute instead of clenching it. And that was it. No final music, no speech, no glory, but something had changed forever. A soldier had been held at gunpoint because of his skin, right in the middle of a funeral, and it would never happen unnoticed again. 3 days after the trial ended, Carter left the base. No motorcade, no flags at half-mast, no farewell speeches. He carried only an old leather bag, his honor record tucked neatly inside a brown envelope, and walked out as if it were just another Tuesday morning. But the press wouldn't let it be ordinary. They had arrived early. No shouting, no scrambling for position. They stood still. As storytellers by trade, yet on this day, merely waiting for the one man who had nothing left to say. Carter wore a dark brown suit, a white shirt. His black shoes were well polished, but not new. No medals glinted. No symbols gave away who he had once been. Just an old military ID card, yellowed with time, hanging loosely from his left wrist. As he stepped past the steel gates of the base, the entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath. He didn't turn back, didn't look around, but when he saw the line of reporters flanking the walkway, his gaze paused, deliberately, like a mark left with intent. No one shouted, no one cut in. Then a young reporter, voice trembling, asked the single question the group had agreed upon. "General Carter, do you have anything you'd like to say to those who followed the case?" He stopped, didn't bow his head, didn't posture. He simply nodded and spoke in a voice not loud but clear enough to reach even the furthest corner. "This isn't about me." Just 5 words, but the impact hit the air like a drumbeat to the chest. Everyone held their breath. Then he continued, face still composed. "It's about those who never had the chance to be seen for who they were." No one replied. No one rushed to take notes. A few even forgot to hit record, because the way Carter spoke, it wasn't to attract attention, nor to become a symbol. It felt like he was simply brushing dust off the lens through which society had looked askew for far too long. A sentence that didn't demand agreement, but no one could argue with it. Carter nodded once more and walked on. No further words, no wave. But from that moment, his not quite 12-word statement took on a life of its own. It appeared on front pages, was quoted on the floors of Congress, printed in HR manuals, chalked onto classroom blackboards. As if everyone instinctively understood, they didn't need him to explain it. They just needed to hear it at the right time. No one called it a historic quote. No one declared him a civil rights hero. But to those who had been misjudged, misnamed, miscategorized, that sentence became a quiet affirmation within them, because they knew someone had not spoken for them, but on their behalf, not in defense, but in confirmation of the existence that had never been fully seen. Within 2 days of that brief statement, Carter's words spread, not through slogans plastered on streets, nor through screaming headlines. They showed up gently, as quotes beneath articles, as captions under profile pictures, as notes pinned quietly to classroom doors, office cubicles, or public bathroom walls, places where people had once been judged for not appearing correct. And what mattered most, it didn't spread like a slogan. No one tried to trademark it. No one printed it on T-shirts to sell. It echoed back, like a late apology for those who never had time to speak up, when they still had the chance. In a high school history class in Ohio, the first lesson after the trial began with a teacher pinning Carter's words on the wall above the U.S. map. No fancy fonts, no underline. Just a plain line. This isn't about me. It's about those who never had the chance to be seen for who they were. A 10th grader, once suspended for non-compliance after refusing a bag check in the hallway, looked up at it, then turned to a friend and whispered, "First time I've heard someone speak for kids like us who never had a voice." No one wrote it down, but no one forgot the look in that student's eyes, like he had been allowed to stand upright for the first time without apologizing for simply existing the way he was. At a veteran support center on the outskirts of New Mexico, there was no portrait of Carter, no ceremony, but his words were printed and placed in the middle of the room, beside the name plaques of those who had passed. An elderly veteran, back slightly bent, tapped the glass and rasped, his voice worn like breath through trench air. "Maybe, if they'd ever looked at me like they should have looked at Carter, my wife wouldn't have had to move us 3 times because the neighbors thought I wasn't safe to live near." No one responded. But everyone lingered longer than usual by the plaques that day, as if the names once forgotten had finally been spoken for. And in Arlington, where it had all begun with an interrupted ritual, a group of law students held a quiet round table in a room with only 12 chairs. They didn't call it an event. No live stream, no celebrity speaker, just a blank sheet in the center of the table, each person writing one question, then reading it aloud. The first one read, "How do we stop a mistaken glance from being enough to make someone a suspect?" On the table, each person had a printout of Carter's quote. Not framed, not gilded, just black text on white paper. By the end of the session, someone said softly, "Maybe law won't change hearts overnight, but at least it can make people pause before they raise their weapon." No one had asked Carter to say that. No one appointed him a voice. But from the way he spoke, calm, unperformed, unshaken, people understood. The right words don't need force to be powerful. They just need the right timing, the right speaker, the right silence, and the right pain. Carter didn't write a memoir, didn't sign a TV deal, but his presence, not as a hero, but as a mirror that had never warped, gave those who had once been mislabeled, misvalued, or misidentified the courage to finally reintroduce themselves, not loudly, not in defense, just rightly, and in peace to be seen. Less than a week after Carter's speech, a 23-minute video surfaced on a conservative social media platform posted by a group calling themselves the Committee for the Defense of Law Enforcement Honor. In the video, a row of silver-haired men with broad shoulders, wearing matching shirts and seated behind a polished wooden desk, took turns defending Harper's actions. They didn't call Carter a fraud, but they labeled the trial a media-driven justice campaign. They didn't mention race, but repeated the phrase, "professional reflex," in an uncertain context. They didn't insult directly, but described Harper as a model of honest policing in an age where emotion trumps reason. They called public outrage a dangerous wave of anti-police sentiment, and in the gravelly closing line, repeated at the end, "We cannot allow political emotions to interfere with professional instincts." And the video spread rapidly. Not because it was powerful, but because it was familiar, that quiet, creeping familiarity, as if people had heard this story a dozen times under different titles. "Just a misunderstanding," he followed protocol. "We need protection too," the same loop. Thought ended by the prior verdict was quietly rebooted, not with a bang, but like someone pressing reset in the hearts of those not yet ready to believe the world had changed. Within a day, conservative outlets began citing the video. A few state-level politicians claimed on the radio that professional standards are being politicized. Anonymous posts flooded forums, questioning whether Carter had actually been verified at the scene. Social media split once again. Carter supporters were labeled radical leftists, while Harper defenders were portrayed as forgotten guardians of order. A petition to restore Harper's honor gained over 10,000 signatures within 48 hours, mainly from suburban areas known for Back the Blue stickers on car windows. In a closed-door meeting in D.C., among media strategists and policy advisors, a once buried question from the Ferguson era resurfaced, this time in a somber tone. Have we gone too far by turning a single incident into a systemic issue? Some were silent, others nodded. But outside that power circle, a group long unheard finally spoke, in full, for the first time, veterans. No press releases, no PR firms, no trendy hashtags, just local veteran groups. From swing states like Arizona to small towns in South Dakota, writing letters, posting messages, sending direct emails to newsrooms and TV stations. They didn't speak of ethics. They spoke of honor, of ritual, of how a funeral salute could be labeled a threatening gesture. They asked, "We were trained to stand still when a comrade falls. Why is a salute now seen as a threat?" A veteran from Florida who lost a hand in Fallujah aired a local radio message. What is a professional reflex if not first to respect military tradition? If that reflex justifies drawing a weapon on a 4-star uniform, then maybe that reflex needed burying long ago. And so, voices never counted as political began to push back, not loudly, but steadily enough to disrupt what once seemed an unbreakable loop. 3 days after the Harper defending video dropped, a quiet but forceful current began rising. A decentralized, nameless, leaderless network of veterans started reposting the same image. Carter, saluting the flag-draped casket, silent still, with his right hand raised in a gesture every soldier knows is sacred. Each post had a single line, not coordinated, not uniform in font, but carrying one shared message. One wrote, "I've stood in that formation." Another, "This isn't politics, this is our ritual being disrespected." A retired lieutenant colonel who lost a leg in Kandahar wrote, "No one has the right to call that salute a threat, and anyone who does never truly served." They didn't speak of laws, didn't care about which side won. They didn't justify. They simply affirmed some things cannot be misnamed. And for the first time, social media wasn't spreading scandal, but a disrupted ritual, and the refusal to let it be forgotten. They didn't need to speak, but they did, and when they did, voices long sidelined followed. A brown-skinned mother once told her son looked suspicious for wearing a hoodie, wrote, "They once said my son resembled someone dangerous. But today, I saw the man they feared had once kept peace." A high school teacher, reprimanded for teaching police bias, printed Carter's quote and posted it in the school board hallway. Indigenous, Asian American, Muslim, and previously profiled communities, people who had been taught to stay silent, to stay alive, now shared one line, like a key through memory. This isn't about one man. It's about all of us who were misjudged. And even the quietest corners of the system began to stir. In the military, where everything is typically buried under administrative phrasing, a leaked memo from the Department of Defense called for a review of civilian-military coordination protocols, especially during funerals. The memo was brief, not threatening, but its final boxed sentence stood like a written oath. The honor of service does not lie in the stars on the shoulder, but in how one is saluted when they depart. No one was arrested, no extremist groups banned, no raids took place, but the once loud voices defending Harper began to fade, not silenced, but drowned, not choked, but overshadowed by something deeper, quieter, and harder to dismiss. This time, society reacted differently. No blind fury, no seasonal hashtags, just a collective stillness, as if everyone recalibrated justice's pitch. And in that shift, one thing no longer needed proof. The truth, when called by its right name, doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to stand straight, raise its right hand, and look into the eyes of the one who pointed the gun. 10 days after the Pentagon memo leaked, calling for stricter cooperation during ceremonies, the Virginia State Police did the unthinkable. They held a press conference announcing a full review of all internal complaints from the past 15 years, starting with cases marked insufficient grounds. No apology, no remorseful tone. The spokesperson read only 2 lines. "We are not doing this due to public pressure. We are doing this because we failed to listen when it mattered." But behind those 2 lines were hundreds of signs that this shift wasn't linguistic, it was structural. An independent unit was formed with full access to closed files. 247 previously dismissed cases were reopened. 38 senior officers who served at Arlington since 2010 were required to cooperate with federal investigators with clear warning. Refusal would be considered obstruction of justice. No fanfare, no documentaries. But the public knew. The wheels had turned, not from an outside knock, but from the system's own heartbeat. The initial probe stayed quiet, but the results could not be. Within 3 weeks, 5 police officers were indicted. Their names weren't redacted, their decorated pasts weren't shielded. One, a 3-time Officer of the Year, was charged with falsifying reports and coercing citizens into false confessions without video evidence. Another, once Harper's deputy, was found to have approved 62 arrests with inconsistent time and location logs, over 80% involving black men under 25. A retired officer was accused of threatening a single mother with putting her child on a juvenile watch list unless she signed a pre-written statement. The public was angry, but this time, the anger wasn't emotional. It was clear-eyed. What was shocking wasn't the abuse of power, but that the system no longer protected it. No curtains, no internal reports, every report made public, every file opened. The department's new chief, young, appointed post-Harper scandal, didn't bring data charts or speeches. He stepped up, looked directly at the cameras, and said one sentence: "If this system ever believed silence meant loyalty, today we will prove that loyalty means never letting anyone stay wrong without being named." There was no applause, no memes. But after that day, even those who once saw this as an isolated case understood. Harper was not alone, and neither was Carter. A system had allowed one man to draw the gun and another to salute, not because he felt safe, but because it was the only way left to protect what was right. And for the first time in years, doors long sealed with the words insufficient evidence, standard protocol, and high risk were finally opened, not by force, but by a collective will to salvage what decency remained. 10 days after a leaked Pentagon memo urged military units to coordinate more cautiously around memorial protocols, the Virginia State Police did what no one expected. They held a press conference announcing the reopening of all internal complaints from the past 15 years, starting with those previously dismissed as insufficient grounds. There was no apology, no remorseful tone. The spokesperson read a statement only 2 lines long. "We're not doing this because of public pressure. We're doing this because we once failed to listen when it mattered." But beyond those 2 lines were hundreds of signs that the change wasn't in words. It was in structure. An independent review team was formed with full access to sealed files. 247 previously dismissed cases were reopened. A list of 38 supervisory officers who had served in Arlington since 2010 were required to cooperate with federal investigators. Refusal would now be treated as obstruction of justice. There were no cheers, no long exposés. But society recognized something had shifted, not because of knocks from the outside, but because something had started pounding from within the system. The investigation began quietly, but its outcomes could not stay hidden for long. Within 3 weeks, 5 officers were criminally charged. Their names were not redacted, their celebrated resumes were not shielded. One, a 3-time Officer of the Year, was accused of falsifying scene reports and coercing civilians into confessions without evidence. Another, Harper's former deputy, had approved 62 arrest records with timeline inconsistencies, nearly 80% involving black individuals under 25. A retired officer had allegedly threatened a single mother, saying her son would be added to a juvenile watch list if she didn't sign a pre-written statement. Public outrage followed, but it wasn't emotional, it was clear-eyed. The shock wasn't the abuse of power, it was how the system responded. No more protection, no more curtains, no more "we'll review internally." Every report was made transparent, and case files were posted publicly. The new department spokesperson, a young commander appointed after the Harper scandal, brought no charts, no speeches. He stepped up to the press podium, looked directly into hundreds of cameras, and said a single sentence: "If this system once believed silence was loyalty, then today, we will prove that loyalty means not letting anyone keep getting it wrong without being named." The line wasn't turned into a meme. There was no applause. But from that day on, even those who thought this was an isolated case began to understand Harper was not alone, and Carter was not alone. There was a system that once allowed a man to raise a gun and another man to stand and salute, not because he wasn't afraid, but because it was the only way left to defend what was right. And for the first time in years, doors that had long been sealed shut with words like insufficient procedural compliance or high-risk protocol were finally opened, not by force, but by a desire to preserve whatever decency remained within the institution. The most devastating twist of the investigation wasn't the 5 prosecutions. It was what connected them. A special report by the Department of Justice and the Independent Prosecutor's Office exposed a quiet framework that no one had ever named aloud. A system of power allocation operated through shift assignments, risk profile lists, and performance review metrics, all built on something never officially written down: bias. In this system, Harper was not the mastermind. He was simply the final link in a pipeline. The man who raised the gun wasn't making a rogue decision. He had been conditioned to believe that his action was necessary, encouraged, and free from consequence. Practices like preemptive checks without stated cause, target classification based on low-income zones, and night shift patrols to control civilian response were all documented in internal guides, and no one objected. Not because they didn't see, but because everyone assumed someone else had approved. In that invisible circle, wrongdoing didn't begin with an order. It began with silent, repetitive consent, until it became a form of professional norm. A leaked 2015 internal email showed a senior officer advising a rookie with what he called soft skills wisdom. For certain people, don't let them pass without a check, because if you do, you'll be the one getting checked. No one corrected the line. No one flagged it. In 2018, during a performance review, a recording surfaced in which someone half joked, half meant, "We need high reaction numbers. We don't need perfection. Just don't let someone good die from bad PR." These lines, once dismissed as internal culture, were now revealed as fossils of an ideology that had been coded into KPIs, review checklists, and training materials. It was no longer just prejudice, it was a priority action filter, a covert algorithm of operational policy. And that's what made the public response shift from instinctive anger to existential reckoning. For the first time, society had to confront a question it had never dared say aloud. If what Harper did was wrong, then one of the things that had been praised, promoted, and reinforced for over a decade. While media coverage exploded and social networks churned with debate, another form of silence began to spread. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of people finally examining themselves. Some retired officers issued public apologies for having ignored early signs just to avoid trouble. A few members of past review boards admitted they had suspected some reports, but didn't want to spark internal conflict. Certain local departments temporarily halted officer transfers, not to reassure but to recheck who had once signed off on overnight reports. And within that wave of introspection, a new question surfaced, not from the justice system, but from law enforcement itself. If Harper was only a link in the chain, how many others had pointed their guns, not because they had to, but because they were allowed? 3 weeks after the trial, when public attention had calmed and the media moved on to new stories, Michael Carter received a rough paper envelope. No sender, no stamp, only a short, handwritten line in black ink for Alan's last friend. The envelope wasn't thick or heavy, carried no ceremonial items, no official letterhead, no seal, no business card. Inside was a single yellowed sheet of handwritten paper. The lines slanted gently, clear and deliberate, as if the writer had transcribed memory rather than written a letter. It was from Lieutenant Colonel Alan Reeves's wife. She didn't call Carter General. She didn't mention what had happened at the funeral, didn't comment on the trial or the surrounding uproar. She began simply, "You don't need to apologize. You don't need to speak." Then she recounted one of her husband's final evenings when he looked at her and said, "If anyone has the right to send me off, it's Michael Carter. No one else ever took a bullet for me," and then lived as if it never happened. She continued, "He always believed you'd show up someday, not for recognition, but to keep your word. And you did. You stood there. Amid all the doubt and scrutiny, you stood there. No one needed you to explain anything. Because to me, your presence alone was enough." The letter wasn't long. No climax, no dramatic tears, and for that very reason it left a deeper mark than any standing ovation. Carter didn't read it twice. He didn't let anyone else read it. He didn't fold it into his wallet, didn't frame it. He folded it exactly along the original crease and placed it carefully inside his old field notebook, the one he'd kept since 1983, its spine frayed, corners stained with blood, dust, and the mildew of frontline bases. That notebook contained maps of Mosul, names of every soldier under his command, and even Alan's handwritten marks from an old debate about retreat routes. Now, it carried one more piece, not an order, not a medal, but a final reminder of brotherhood. Not everyone survives, but those who do must not forget why they're still here. Carter never told Lily about the letter, never told anyone. Not because it was sacred, but because it was one of the rare apologies in his life that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The letter didn't change Carter's life. It didn't make him forgive anyone, nor did it erase the memory of standing at gunpoint in a national cemetery. But it was the one thing that made him feel less alone afterward. Not because it healed, but because it remembered the right person, the right moment, the right silence. It wasn't a thank you, not praise, but a confirmation that his presence that day, even if unrecognized, even if uncelebrated, was seen by one person, the woman who had once held the hand of the fallen soldier and who understood that some promises between soldiers don't need rewriting. They only need keeping. When Carter folded the letter and tucked it away, he didn't feel relieved or at peace. He simply felt enough. On an early morning at the end of the season, Carter returned to Arlington. No announcement, no procession, no government vehicle, just an old man driving a faded silver car, quietly parking near the cemetery fence, at the exact spot where he'd stood months earlier. Back then, the entire country held its breath to see how he would react to a drawn weapon. Today was different. No one waited. No eyes followed, no broadcasts mentioned his name anymore. The storm had passed, strong enough to lift some old tiles, but not enough to change the entire house. Carter walked in, no medals, no uniform, just an old suit and frayed white gloves, the same ones he'd worn when burying a comrade, the same ones once marked by a gun's aim. His shoes clicked softly on the gravel path, and with each step came a rhythm, not of remembering an event, but of remembering a person. And a muddy night in Mosul, when only 2 men survived the 3rd artillery round. Reeves had broken ribs. Carter's wrist was cut by shrapnel, but they crawled through the ditch to drag 3 privates to safety. No cameras, no report, only a promise. If we make it out, we'll meet one last time. Not to tell, but to nod. Carter sat on the stone bench near Reeves' grave. The breeze moved through the flags, not loud, not showy, just fabric brushing like the breath of memory. He didn't read the name on the stone, didn't bow, didn't salute. He simply sat, back straight, eyes fixed on the cemetery's central flagpole. The flag hung true, unsullied, unfaded, and precisely because of its perfection, it reminded him of all the imperfect things that had kept him alive on the battlefield. detailed. The medic's crooked stitches, the smeared map, the too young officer, and Reeves' rasping voice in the firelit night. "Mike, are you still alive?" That's what he had carried for years. He had lived. Reeves had not, and no one asked him to retell that. But he lived as a man who had once been spared by someone who'd never get the chance to prove they were a hero. And now, as he sat there, needing no witness, he simply looked at the flag, as if seeing the very reason he still existed. No words, no explanation. Because at some point, presence alone is enough to fulfill a promise. No photos were taken. No footage spread, but a young patrol soldier later recalled that morning. He'd passed by a grave and saw an older black man sitting still, white gloves, unmoving. The wind blew, but his coat didn't flutter. His shoulders didn't shake, and though his eyes didn't weep, they looked far enough to seem like they were seeing something no one else could. The soldier didn't interrupt, but the next day he returned quietly and placed a coin on Reeves' headstone, the way American soldiers do when they believe someone had come before them. Carter never knew, might never know. But what he left that morning wasn't a mark, it was a place, the seat of a surviving soldier, not to recount anything, but to never forget that someone had fallen the right way, and he had shown up at the right time. The atmosphere in the federal courtroom that day was unlike any previous hearing. There were no more rustling papers, no half-hearted gestures of defense, no attorneys scrambling over technicalities. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Everything that needed to be seen had been shown, on social media feeds, in internal briefings, across meeting rooms in the Justice Department. The verdict was no longer about judging a single event. It was the final punctuation on a long series of unhealed wounds. Harper sat there, uncuffed, but no longer needing to defend himself. His face showed fatigue, but none of it looked like remorse. The evidence was summarized briefly, not for debate, but as a procedural reminder of what everyone already knew. The video showing a firearm aimed directly at a military general during a national ceremony. Witness statements from dozens present. Unsealed disciplinary records. 5 prior internal warnings for racially biased conduct in duty. But what made everyone hold their breath that day wasn't the details. It was how the judge saw through to the root. This wasn't a case of someone acting out of fear in a moment of chaos. It was a conscious act. Force used not out of necessity, but from the belief that it would be excused. The judge, a thin older man of Quaker heritage who had previously presided over gender discrimination cases within the military, didn't raise his voice. He didn't speak at length, but each word he chose felt like it had been honed over a lifetime in the law. The defendant, Harper, did not act out of a momentary lapse. He acted after a long history of being allowed to be wrong without being stopped. His fear did not come from the situation, but from a habit of seeing skin color as a measure of threat. And the law does not recognize that habit as mitigation. He paused. The room was still. Then he delivered the sentence. The court hereby sentences the defendant, Doug Harper, to life imprisonment without parole and without eligibility for sentence reduction under any form. Grounds: armed intimidation of a senior officer during a national ceremony, compounded by repeated racially motivated misconduct. Some held their breath, some bowed their heads, but no one wept. The verdict didn't bring satisfaction. It landed like a dry blade, precise, cold, without emotion. Carter was not present in the courtroom. He had not come to watch a man fall. He had told Lily once, justice doesn't need us to witness someone's downfall. It just needs us to remember where we've had to walk away from. But in that room, others who had remained silent began to change. Several mid-ranking officers, once quiet during the initial hearings, stood up, facing Harper as the sentence was read. A young female officer, once evaluated by Harper, tightened her grip on a colleague's hand as his name was spoken for the last time. No one clapped, but in their eyes something was clear. A uniform was not enough to wash away guilt. And on that day, no one had the right to stand within the system and claim exemption from the values they had once sworn to protect. When Harper was escorted out of the courtroom, No one crowded around. No cameras zoomed in for close-ups. He walked slowly, uncuffed, but every step seemed to drag the unraveling of an entire chapter behind him. His suit was wrinkled, his sleeves slightly loose, his collar crooked, not from carelessness, but because the frame that once commanded fear had collapsed. The gestures of authority were gone. Only the posture of a man stripped of the structure that once shielded him, and now no one followed. Outside, the sky was dry. A soft breeze passed, but Harper didn't lift his head. The way he stepped down the courthouse stairs, it was as if the ground beneath him no longer believed in the weight of his footsteps. He said nothing, looked at no one, and no one called his name one last time. In the courtroom's evidence display, one detail held people's attention. Not a photograph or a video, but a hanger. On it hung Harper's former police uniform, dark ceremonial blue, command insignia on the shoulders, 3 personal commendation pins on the chest. Items that once symbolized duty, honor, and authority now hung lifeless, like the shed skin of something with no memory. No one denied the uniform once represented the law, but for the first time, people saw it as a hollow shell, housing a man who never truly understood what he had been trusted to uphold. Across from the uniform was a wooden table, laid out with objects from Harper's 15 years in service. A sidearm, a name tag case, a police excellence certificate signed by the mayor in 2012. But when placed together, these items were no longer proof of merit. They were relics of an era when no one asked who were these things used to protect and who was he most afraid of. There were no cheers after the verdict, no banners declaring justice won. But in small conversations, at coffee shops, hospital corridors, even neighborhood watch meetings, people began to admit this wasn't just a sentence for Harper. It was a reckoning for the system that let a man like Harper exist for too long without being questioned. Some retired officers shared that they had once felt something was off during evaluations, but said nothing. A clerical worker admitted she'd handled at least 10 complaints about Harper, but was instructed to resolve internally. And now, with everything called by its true name, the only thing left was the image of the uniform, folded carefully, sealed in a case file, labeled with a barcode. A young court clerk, barely 30, quietly pressed the tag onto the bag and said, not as a warning, but like a final farewell. A uniform only means something when the person wearing it knows when to bow. 1 week after the verdict was handed down, the media began to shift its focus. News segments that once aired every hour were now relegated to archives. The images, hashtags, and commentary dissecting race and power slowly sank beneath a wave of newer headlines. The federal court portal marked the case closed with a single cold line, no parole, sentence executed. Veteran organizations stopped sending petitions. Prosecutors ceased updates. Social media, once a storm-battered coastline, began to level out. Some still had photos of Carter at the funeral on their profiles, but the comment sections had thinned. People who once argued passionately were now occupied with the next headline, the local elections, gas prices, and the approaching basketball season. But elsewhere, in a rhythm that required no announcement, Carter returned to a small park in Charleston where he had sat each morning since retiring. No press, no audience, no fanfare, just an old stone bench, a weathered flagpole, and a brick path whose edges had worn down with time. This time he brought no notebook, no newspaper. Resting on his lap was a dress cap, not on his head, not pressed to his chest, but simply placed there, like evidence of something that had passed but was still present. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows across the grass. Not dramatic, but enough to see him clearly, upright, shoulders square, one hand resting as if measuring the precise weight of time gone by. The locals continued their routines. Joggers passed, an elderly woman with a walker paused briefly, then moved on. No one stopped to ask questions, but no one failed to recognize him. There was no need for chatter or praise. They simply nodded as they passed, acknowledging that something large had happened and that this man, the one sitting quietly, was the reason it had happened without breaking. Carter didn't react. He didn't nod back. He didn't smile. Nor did he perform the role of a symbol. His eyes gazed forward, not fixed on anything, but not adrift either, as though he were guarding an invisible border between silence and forgetfulness. A group of high school students passed. At first they joked and laughed, but as they drew closer, the one in front slowed. No one told them to, but all of them stopped briefly. No selfies, no questions, no messages sent, and they moved on, quietly, as if their morning had just received something not listed in their syllabus, but destined to outlast any classroom lesson. Carter didn't watch them go. He didn't turn to anyone, but he knew, and everyone who saw him there knew, that today's silence wasn't withdrawal. It was a form of transmission, not in speeches, not through platforms, not via press. Just one man who at once stood upright where others might have bowed, now sitting in the same place, not out of nostalgia or regret, but because what is right should not vanish with a news cycle. The cap on his lap was the final marker. It was no longer a symbol of rank. It didn't need to be a badge of pride. It was simply a confirmation that some people don't need monuments. They just need to be in the right place, so the next generation knows that standing up is noble, but sometimes sitting still at the right moment is what keeps a world from falling apart. Lily arrived just before 8 a.m., carrying 2 paper cups of coffee, a habit that hadn't yet become a memory. She didn't speak when she reached him. She didn't ask why he was here a week after everything. She placed the coffee beside him and sat on his left. The space between them didn't need to be filled with words. Carter kept looking forward, toward the stretch of grass where the oak trees cast their silhouettes and the flagpole still stood, steady, even though the breeze was barely there. No one looked at the other. No one rushed anything. A morning neither excessive nor lacking. And in a moment where even breathing seemed measured, Carter raised his hand, resting it gently on the cat. No adjustment, no salute, no gesture. Just held it, like a final piece of evidence. Then he tilted his head slightly, and his voice rose. Not loud, not deep, but so clear no one could mistake it as incidental. We don't need to be loud, we need to be still, in the right place. No more, no less, no explanation. Lily didn't reply. She didn't nod. She didn't turn away. She simply placed her hand over his, not clasping, not gripping, just enough to let one man know he was not alone, and to let the world know that some things are said just once, so they never have to be repeated. A gentle breeze passed. A few leaves fluttered down, not landing on shoulders, not catching on the cap. The distant flag moved slightly, just enough to show that the space was still alive, but that no one needed to rush. No sirens, no shutters clicking, only the tap of a toddler's shoes against the bricks as a mother pushed a stroller past, then paused silently. Perhaps she didn't know who he was. Perhaps she had seen the story but couldn't recall the name. But she understood something important was being held in place on that bench, and she taught her child by simply standing still without hurrying. There was no closing music, no applause, no curtain fall, but everyone who passed through that park that morning, even if they didn't post it, even if they didn't photograph it, carried with them a clear image. An old man, sitting still, back straight, hand on a cap that had once meant something official and now meant something else entirely. And in his eyes there was no complaint, just a quiet truth, almost extinct in this age of speed and outrage, that sometimes stillness in the right place is the greatest act one can offer the world. The story of General Michael Carter is not simply a clash between a decorated soldier and a misguided officer. It is a reminder, firm but never loud, of how we as members of this society still measure human worth through layers of bias, titles, skin color, or the sound of one's voice. When Carter had a gun pointed at him in the middle of his comrade's funeral, the insult wasn't just personal. It was aimed at the very idea of honor, dignity, and justice, principles that should be untouchable in a country that claims freedom as its foundation. Carter didn't fight back with violence. He didn't raise his voice because he knew a man who's carried his brothers through gunfire, who has stood between death and duty, doesn't need to prove his worth through shouting or paperwork. He stood still, like a wall against a flood of prejudice, and that stillness, that unshakable silence, was enough to force the system to stop, look again, and perhaps for the first time in years, admit it had been seeing things wrong. So what do we learn from Carter? That judgment must not be rushed. You cannot understand a person's journey in a glance, a uniform, or a skin tone, and no one has the right to treat someone as a threat simply because they refuse to bow to your assumptions. We learn that talent and integrity aren't always loud. Carter didn't demand recognition. He didn't ask to be honored. But when he finally spoke, just once, the entire country paused to listen. His calm, at the right moment, in the right place, became a blueprint for a new kind of strength, one that proves justice doesn't need to shout, but it always finds a way. If you've ever been misunderstood because someone didn't take the time to know you, then you know how Carter must have felt. If you've ever been dismissed, doubted, or denied, even though you knew you'd done right, you've stood in the same space he once occupied. And if you still hold on to patience, refusing to meet injustice with hatred, but with dignity instead, then you've already proved more than any medal ever could. But this lesson isn't just for the victim. It's a wake-up call for the system, because the real danger isn't that a gun was drawn, it's that so many eyes had grown used to watching it happen without ever speaking up. What used to be called loyalty, in silence, must now be redefined. Loyalty is not protecting the wrong. It's having the courage to name it before it leaves a scar too deep to heal. That's why, if this story makes you think, let others think with you. Share it, not to argue, but to remind those who've ever sat alone like Carter, misjudged, misnamed, that they are not alone. Tell others that some things deserve to be remembered, even if no one ever hands out an award for it. Have you ever been misjudged just because someone didn't understand you? Have you ever been underestimated, only to quietly prove you were more than they imagined? If the answer is yes, then Carter is not just a story. He is part of your own journey. And if you believe this story should be preserved, share it. Let others learn from it, awaken from it, and find strength in knowing how to stand quietly in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful real stories, because sometimes what changes a society isn't an uprising, but a soldier sitting quietly in a park, raising his right hand, not to clench, but to salute.